Well, welcome everybody. It's Friday again. Actually, it's Wednesday today. We are pre-recording today's episode simply because of some travel arrangements, and it was just a little bit easier to catch our very special guest today a couple days ahead of the actual stream date. So it is Wednesday and not too far behind the actual live date. I don't think we'll miss any major events in the industry in 2 days, but you never know. It so happens that things change very rapidly. And I do have a very special guest today, Mr. Kris Jensen, who is a fractional technology leader out in the enterprise space primarily, but also working very closely with MSPs everywhere. Kris, thank you so much for joining today. Welcome. How are you?
Hi, Luis. I'm doing great. Thank you very much for giving me a platform to come on to your live stream, and I feel very grateful. So thank you.
No, it's really my pleasure. We were chatting with Nathan Taylor of SourcePass a few weeks ago, and as I usually do, I sent a follow-up thank you, and I said, hey, if you know anybody that'd be great for the show, feel free to mention their name. And he immediately came back with a very thoughtful response, saying, I think Kris would be great. He's done some really cool stuff with the CIO role in enterprise, and I think it's super relevant to MSPs. And so I reached out, and I loved your response, by the way. If Nathan says I should do something, I just immediately do it without questioning it. So thanks for being here. If this all goes to hell, then maybe we'll just blame Nathan anyways. So,
We blame Nathan no matter what, Luis. So I think we're safe.
That's right. Well, I think, you and I caught up ahead of today to chat a little bit about this CIO role in enterprise. And I think it's so interesting because obviously there are so many differences into how MSPs actually do what we are calling the vCIO role, and so many of these maybe crossing the chasm of account management into actual strategy and where the role sits inside the organizational structure and so on. There's so many interesting things. But I thought maybe I could ask you to tell a bit of the backstory of how you ended up in doing the fractional piece specifically, and why it was that appealing as opposed to sort of an internal, full-time gig, as a starting point.
I appreciate the question because I get asked it a lot, and so why did I choose this path versus another? And so the first part of my career, sorry, I've got to scratch my throat. The first part of my career was in consulting, and then I got into operations. And somewhere along the line, I said, could I not meld these two things together? Can I not be an operational leader, but take some of the methodology, some of the background that I had in consulting, and bring those together in a very different light? And so it was through a series of in the last 10 years, through a series of coming on as a fractional, then coming or going full time, and then rinse and repeat and doing it over again once there was an exit, where late last year, after a very challenging full-time CIO role, I thought, man, I don't like this. I don't like not having the flexibility. I don't like having to sit in a role where you're really kind of in a maintenance role. You're really you rinse and repeat it every day. And why not do something that would be transformative to the industry and to companies, particularly in that middle market space, where I could bring my enterprise experience down market and help those mid-sized companies look at technology in a very different fashion. So that's what prompted me to do what I'm doing. Is I think there's a market for it, and I think that companies desperately need it. They may not know they need it, but there's definitely a need there.
Yeah, and maybe can you speak a little bit to perhaps the ideal client profile, or ICP, as some of the smart marketing folks might toss around? Because I find it interesting that I think in many cases they're the same client profile that might hire a full-time internal CIO might also be perfectly suited for a fractional CIO, and perhaps that person is helping delegate to teams and some of the other stuff. So I'm curious sort of where that fence is, so to speak.
Yeah. No, you know, I talk about this a lot. What is my ICP? I picked up the marketing terms and gone with it, it's an important item because, I will say, companies from $10 million in revenue up to 500 million. Now, ideally, that range is more around 50 to 75 million, up to 500 million is that really that sweet spot where companies are in a position of saying, I might have an IT manager, I might have an MSP, I might have an IT director, but they're very tactically focused. and they're focused on keeping the lights on, keeping the business running, and keeping the architecture in a good place. But they're not looking at technology from a strategic perspective. They're not looking at it and saying, I'm trying to scale and grow my business. Do I have the right ERP, the right financial systems in place? Do I have the right reporting in place? Do I have the right CRM in place? And so if you look at it strictly from an infrastructure perspective, probably be a more than fine. But it's when you get to more of that application level, the process level, that's where somebody who's got more experience in that arena, at least that I've discovered, it is where somebody of my background can be far more helpful to them than otherwise.
Hmm. And I imagine, from company to company, there's maybe some baseline of transplantability of the skill set around strategy and the things that you're constantly helping those businesses to solve for from a planning perspective. But maybe help me understand how much is unique to each business, because I feel like maybe that's where the quote unquote rubber hits the road in many ways,
Right.
and where it becomes perhaps a little more tactical than it needs to be. And so I guess managing that is perhaps part of the whole premise of being a fractional CIO in the first place.
Yeah, you're right. So let's take two contrasting industries, healthcare and construction, both of which that I've worked in. Healthcare is very compliance driven. They've got patient data, so they got to look at data in a very different perspective and how they secure the data. Whereas construction is they're not as concerned about the secure. When I say security, they're not dealing with PII data, patient data or something of that nature. Where if it was exposed to the marketplace, they would have some serious ramifications from it. But if you take and say, well, what's commonality between the two of them? It's their use of data to drive decisions, using data to make different, more forethought, more, looking out over the horizon of what they need to do. And so, you look at those two separately from an infrastructure perspective, or as you say, the tactical perspective. But where they're common is how they use data and how they use data analytics to make better decisions.
Yeah. Do you feel, and to bring the MSP back into the equation, because you talk about sort of the difference between being tactical and being strategic. Do you feel that MSPs are just innately at a disadvantage from the opportunity or capability to be strategic when they're trying to do a bit of this CIO function or vCIO function? I suppose it's a function of the size of the business as well to some extent, but perhaps there's a little bit of baggage there too.
No, if they are at a disadvantage because most business owners look at technology professionals, and they lump the MSP into that. They know how to fix a PC, they know how to fix a server, they know how to keep the systems up and running, but they don't always look at those individuals and that they might understand their business. They might understand the nuances of their business. They may not be uniquely familiar with where process comes into play. And so they do get a discount of what they know this, but they don't know that. And so they can't help me.
Hmm. Yeah, so I think the role of the CIO is perhaps in that way very different than the MSP. There's been a few conversations lately, both on LinkedIn or just anecdotally at conferences and things like that, where I've heard people make the comment that vCIO, as we know it in the MSP industry today, it feels a bit like lipstick on account management, to put it that way. And so I think there's a couple questions I want to maybe get your feedback on. One is where the vCIO role sits inside of an organization is interesting. I think the MSP organization tends to put a vCIO perhaps under business development or sales effectively. And I've heard conversations around how important it is for that to be truly a service-oriented role. And I wouldn't imagine a CIO is ever in the interest. A fractional CIO is certainly not trying to resell anything to their clients. But tell me a bit of your own I guess, process in terms of getting the client thinking about new initiatives and how that comes across to them in your role as a CIO? Because I know how it comes across from a vCIO perspective is the clients sometimes feel like they're just being pitched all the time by the MSP
Yep.
to buy more stuff. And so I think this is a unique departure point in how the client perceives that role in their relationship with their IT provider.
Yeah, there is that perception that a vCIO in an MSP is really coming in. They're doing a quarterly business review of some sort, saying your switches are aging, your servers are aging, you need to update your software. It could be a mixture of anything. I put back into the infrastructure category. The where I think the fractional CIO is uniquely positioned is they're not looking at a solution to upgrade anything. What they're really looking at is the needs of the business. They're uniquely aware of the business challenges. They're uniquely aware of where the business is going from a strategic perspective because they sit differently in the organization. They sit more at the executive level. And so they're not looking at, I need to replace that server. Now that might be, on the roadmap, that's something that needs to be considered, but they're more focused on where's the best use of technology dollars to grow the business and from a revenue standpoint, the ROI. What's going to have a greater impact on the business? This purchase decision or that purchase decision? And so that's the fundamental difference that I see is looking at understanding the needs of the business, looking at it through a lens from a business perspective, and not looking at it as a sale opportunity at all, but it's just how do I move the needle for the business in a way that maybe they haven't looked at before.
Mm. I think there's an interesting nuance here too, and it's that I think for IT providers, there is certainly a spectrum of the size of client that they work with. Sometimes it's a 20-person client, sometimes it's a 200 or 500-person client, and that's probably on the upper range of client size that I see the average IT provider work with. Beyond that, it tends to become more of a co-managed relationship, it
Yeah.
seems like. But I'm curious to try and tap into what is maybe a little abstract in my mind at the moment, but this idea of like the client's own respect for your capability to deliver a sound strategy. With the guise of like been there, done that, I think is maybe the thing that is kind of the requirement. And maybe small business owners, the 20-person businesses, 30-person businesses, they still very much rely on emotionally, psychologically on the IT provider because that IT provider, vCIO, is a 30-person business, 50-person business, and they are very much in the same soup and nuts of the same things they're dealing with. But I think when the discrepancy grows, the 20-person MSP or 50-person MSP is working with a 500-person client, I think perhaps the executive team at that big client does not give that strategic person the time of day, or doesn't really take their advice as the kind of gospel that they perhaps should. So I'm curious about that, transition, that threshold, and how you've seen that play out even in your transition as you got more experience and worked with bigger clients over time.
Yeah, Luis, you bring up an interesting point. I hadn't really looked at it from that perspective that, small business, relating to the needs of another small business. And so they're looking at them very much as peers or, collaborative partners. But you're right. Small businesses want to know at least that another small business feels their pain and understanding and maybe can look at it from a different standpoint. Um, but as you get into the larger enterprise, you're right. What happens is that organization begins to scale and grow. What happens is they tend to push down. When I say push down, it's not intentionally. They tend to discount the views of the whether it's internal or externally, whether it's an MSP or an internal IT department. They tend to view them very different as they don't see the business the way I see the business. They don't see the pains the way I see the business, and so they don't rely on them in the same aspect of can I go to that individual and can I really extract out of them the information I need to move my business in a different way than has been done before? Can they look at it differently? And even if they came up with a different idea, I think they would be discounted as well. They really don't understand what I'm doing.
Hmm.
And that's
Yeah.
an opinion. It's simply an opinion, but it is something that I've seen happen, frequently.
I think it plays out in many situations. In particular with the MSP ecosystem. The peer groups, the any type of organized structure of folks talking to each other. They tend to organize in groups of similar revenue,
Yeah.
or similar roles, and I think those are the unique distinctions. And even when the same roles are together, the revenue of the company they work for tends to be the differentiator between whether they can have an actual productive conversation or not. So, and often, and I see this all the time. MSPs also don't want advice from another MSP who hasn't been there, done that type of thing.
Yeah.
There just seems to be things you go through at that threshold, and never before. And I get that. That's just the way the cookie crumbles, I suppose. But maybe it helps to understand a bit of your own process, because I think one of the challenges is that I've long believed that we have a bit of a hangover from the VAR days, a bit of this lipstick on account management. And what we know as vCIO is really this cadence of just trying to keep the customer, to come up to a certain baseline of a standard, which is a different struggle. I mean, maybe we should have not called it vCIO. But I'm curious to learn about your perhaps cadence and process of working with a brand new client, perhaps. What are the types of things that you bring into the organization sort of as a requirement to even engage, the involvement the client needs to bring to the table? Because those are things I think MSPs struggle with as well, getting the client to participate in their own rescue, so to speak.
Yeah, one of, and this is just taking my narrow scope of experience, but there's two things that what I do, what an MSP would do in common is come in and assess. So they do it, what they call a technology assessment. Now, where the road forks very quickly is my assessment does, it looks at how are they addressing security, but I'm not doing penetration tests or anything of that nature. I'm really, from a strategic standpoint, how do they look at security? What's their infrastructure look like? What's the age of the infrastructure? What are the challenges with the infrastructure? But then I get into the data. So what are they doing with data management, data security, data replication, data reporting, data analytics? And so I'm looking at data from that perspective. Then I get into business process. What are the challenges in the business process? Where are the applications breaking it from an application perspective? Where are those aligning in the organization? Is their CRM doing, meeting the needs of the organization? Is their ERP meeting the needs of the organization? What are the unique challenges with it? And then getting in what I call the service management. How well is IT servicing the business? Are they providing the level of service that the business needs? So you'll see a few things in there, and I've mixed them all together. But there's certain things where I would, what I've seen with an MSP is they come in and assess security, maybe doing penetration tests, and even how they're layering technology together, and what their cybersecurity risk. They're looking at the infrastructure, they're looking at the endpoints, they're looking at MDM, but the ones I've seen, and they may even look at data from the standpoint, is there business continuity? Is there replication offsite? How are the backups working? But the difference is, and all of those things I'm doing, but it's that additional layer of how are they using data? How is data driving business decisions? What are they using their applications for? How are the applications driving different business decisions? And in order to do that, you're meeting with I do it in a workshop form. You're meeting with different layers within the business, so you're gaining a different understanding of the use of technology through the organization. That an MSP, just that's not something on their roadmap that they do. At least my experience has been they just don't do that.
Well, I think the other piece that immediately came to mind as you were kind of talking through all these things that you're doing right from the get-go is that, imagine yourself getting more tactical from the beginning and focusing on, server infrastructure or what have you. it might be difficult to kind of pull back out to the 30,000-foot view 6 months down the road. And I think this is maybe an interesting challenge that MSPs go through as well, similar to how the transition from going from break fix to managed services and or recurring revenue was a challenge equally, because once the customer is down that path, they kind of have a really difficult time pulling back out and changing the concept or the notion of what their engagement is like. And I think the same thing happens with strategy. If the MSP comes in very tactical, all they want to know is is antivirus installed and what the load on the UPS is, it might be really difficult to pull that conversation back out to, hey, let's have a look at how your CRM is working for the business and getting truly into a strategic discussion. So maybe that's the learning here, is just a much more consultative approach, especially during the initial assessment and onboarding component of the business. So you can keep that layer of strategy really, really present as you get the relationship kicked off. I don't know, your thoughts on, have you had the opposite happen where you went really tactical and then just couldn't recover to that strategic level again?
I think early on in this journey, yes, it went much more tactical. And then to your point, I created a ceiling for myself because they saw everything I was doing was from a tactical perspective, not a strategic perspective. I'll give you a case study or an example of one of my clients is switching over to a new MSP. And the MSP was coming on site to do an assessment, essentially, so they can support the environment. And the MSP, they start saying, well, oh, you're on a file server. Well, we need to get you to SharePoint. Oh, your access points are old. We need to replace your switches. Oh my goodness, these things are old. We need to replace the switches. And I got a call from the client that said, what the heck is going on here? This is not how you and I operate. What are these guys doing? And so I had to help the MSP say, this is not how we're going to do this. This is how we're going to approach this. But to the client, you talk about, you get kind of that set spot. That client was familiar with a more strategic approach, and all of a sudden somebody's coming at them with a tactical approach, and they're like, no, I don't want that.
Yeah, it's such a difficult muscle memory to change, I think. And this has been the bread and potatoes of MSPs for so many years, that I think this is an interesting transition as we really start to go through it. And I think credit to some of the other roles that are popping up in the MSP ecosystem, like the vCIO stuff, or compliance roles, or things that are kind of really, really pulling the conversation much more into the strategic realm of things, especially where the client has to participate a little bit more. I wanted to ask you maybe about the level of client participation. This was always a frustration to me, because from time to time I'd maybe get into this good rhythm of like, this client really is starting to get it. They seem to care about really talking about strategy. Hey, how can we digitize a bunch of this paper stuff that we have in purchasing, or any number of things that are truly impactful from a technology perspective to their business. And then suddenly stuff starts to erode back into sort of the tactical approach. And I think some clients are their own worst enemy in that sense too. They may have these sort of spurts of strategic desire, but then just get back into a bit of the day-to-day mess themselves. And from your perspective, have you had to pull clients back out of the tactical focus into the strategic one? And what is a couple of good strategies to do that?
Yeah, it's an ongoing struggle, for the most part, because if you look at the most business executives, most leaders in the business, they view IT, does it work or does it not? I had a client who once said, "Hey, Kris, I'm sick of these systems going down. I want it to work like, you pointed the light switch on the wall," and he goes, "I want it to look like that. When I turn it on, it works." He goes, I don't come into my office and wonder if I've got power that day. I come into the office expecting that the power will be on and I'll be able to do my job. And I want systems to do the same thing. And so what happens is then you get into this tactical focus of, I need to make sure that when he flips the switch, it always works. And so you end up going down a rabbit hole with that, because you're thinking of runtime. You're focused on your SLAs, how well you can service the business. And so it's an easy trap to fall into. But in organizations, what I found, in particular, it doesn't matter the size of the organization, where there's a cadence where the business has the opportunity to bring business ideas forward that might might involve technology, might involve some technological element. And sometimes I'll just sit in meetings. I'll sit in business leaders meetings, just hearing what. So yes, tactical is important. Security is important. All of those things that you're doing are important, but they cannot become the paramount thing where that's all you focus on. Because to your point, all of a sudden you see the bright shiny object over here, and you forget what really is going to move the needle for the business. And it doesn't always have to be technology. That's the other thing where credibility comes in. I've oftentimes where the business wanted to throw a technology at it, and I said, okay, no technology is going to solve the problem the way you want it to. Let's look at process. Let's start mapping process. So it's a different, you're looking at it, you're bringing a different mindset to the organization.
Hmm. Yeah, very, very insightful. One of the things we were talking about when we got together about this conversation was this idea of like changing the dynamic of the meeting context, I suppose is the best way I can describe it. One of our partners, Joe Market from Transformative, one of the things that he was talking about when he came on the live stream is they actually started asking their clients to bring him in to their strategic meetings, at least once a year. And what he found very quickly was that the whole MO of the meeting was completely different than the meeting where it's kind of the MO of the MSP is like, yeah, we're gonna get all these projects sort of lined up to present to the client, and the client is kind of avoiding this meeting, to be perfectly honest, because they kind of know and expect what's coming at this point. But he said being in their context, in their meeting cadence, was completely wildly different to what he was used to from the engagement perspective. Never mind the access to the other executive folks at that organization. And so I'm curious if you would support that notion simply from the perspective of an MSP that's maybe having difficulty getting their clients to sort of activate a bit of the strategic mindset.
Now, what you've described, Luis, is critical. Critical maybe overemphasizes it, but think of the conversation's different. I'm not sitting in a meeting trying to sell some new solution. I'm sitting in a meeting simply to learn, simply to listen where the business challenges are, and then take those learnings and you structure them differently. But if you can sit in on a meeting, like you've described, where they're sitting on the strategic meetings, there's, the solutions they bring back are going to be to solve those business challenges or to enhance the business. It's not going to be to pitch some new solution that brings more revenue to the MSP. It comes down to what I call vested interest. Where's your vested interest? Is it to grow the revenue of the organization you work for, or is it to grow the revenue of the organization that you're supporting?
Yeah. Now, we've kind of touched on a bunch of things related to the difference between your truly enterprise CIO, even the fractional nature of it, and what kind of the vCIO picture looks like to some extent. And one of those things was, of course, strategic versus operational focus. I think that's key. The depth of it, one of the other notes that we had made was this idea of the depth of involvement in business decision making. And I think this was an interesting one. I even came across the challenge with one of my clients that I'd been with them since they were 15 people and they grew to 150 people. And at one point, I just got excluded from the business decision making because, like, thanks, Luis, we know how to run our business. And basically they were saying, we don't believe you know anything about our business process or our ability to make business decisions. Despite me seeing some of the mistakes obviously play out at a number of other businesses that size. And so, we kind of mentioned this idea of the discounting of the views or the ideas of the smaller provider or vendor in that role. And part of it is, again, the hangover of having been tactical for so many years. But
Right.
I'm curious, how do you unlock a bit of the access to C-level in those situations where maybe you got brought in by an office admin, maybe you got brought in by a CFO, and that person's just looking at a budgetary number. It's like, oh, I'm tasked with saving us money on IT, and they're even disconnected from some of the strategic, goals of the business. There must be a path or some magic trick there.
Yeah, I have not had to work through that barrier, so I'm not going to be ideal at saying, hey, here's how I accomplished it. I've had the benefit of always coming in at the CEO, CFO, or COO level. So in all of my engagements, it's starting off at the senior level. But if you do, you come up to the office manager. Yeah, they engage with the MSP, and now you're working upstream. Essentially, what they've done, photo lunch, just have a one-on-one where they can see you in a different light than just a business meeting to say, how can I transact with you? If you look at it in a very non-transactional way, if you look at it as a relationship building, I'll give you an idea. Is I was trying to get in front of a company to do some fractional work, and I offered, there's three different CEOs of three different companies that make up one parent company. And I said, let's just have a luncheon discussion. I didn't call it a lunch and learn. I'll bring in sandwiches on my dime, and let's just talk. Let's just have a conversation. Now, they didn't take me up on that, but they did entertain a meeting where I did sit with all three of these CEOs. And had I not, I would have ended up coming through a different door that I think would really have limited my access to make change for the organization, to really influence them in a different way because they viewed me differently.
Yeah. I think those things are, learned experiences that you don't get to understand how to do them until you've done them, to the point of like the lived experiences. But here's an interesting maybe pivot. I think one of the interesting challenges people go through at all stages, I imagine you come across this in your CIO role as well, budgetary limitations, resource allocation. Sometimes there's an interesting discrepancy between what the business wants and strategically has decided that they need to achieve and what they're willing to allocate budgetarily to make those things happen. And the example I give often is, when we did this interesting little 3-question survey for our customers many years ago, it was, what keeps you up at night? If there was a major server room flood, how long do you think it would take to recover? And so the questions or the answers we got to those questions were really interesting. Some people were completely out to lunch. It was like, in 1 hour we can recover from a flood in the server room. And so I think it opened the door to have a more interesting sort of risk tolerance conversation, which I often find is not to be fear-mongering in the conversation, because I've always hated that, but definitely to make the client more aware of risk and their own tolerance for risk. It just gets them to open up to say, okay, well, we can deliver a solution that provides 1 hour of downtime, 1 hour downtime or recoverability capability, and here's the price tag. Or we can deliver a solution that requires 2 days of downtime, and here's that price tag. And it seems a lot of it comes down to expectations. And so I'm curious to ask you about your own expectation management with clients, especially in situations where their desires are completely out of line with their budget.
Yeah, let's talk about security for a minute. One of the nuances of a business says, "Well, I've never been hacked. I've never had anybody come in. They're not interested in me, the small guy." And the answer is they're interested in everybody. They're not respecter of how much revenue you have. They're respective of how easy you are to get in. And so, one of the challenges that I've had with business is they don't want to spend money on that. They don't see that as an ROI. There's not an ROI. So you have to equate it in terms of risk. How much risk are you willing to take on? And so how I have done that is working with business owners on continuity plans, business continuity plans, disaster recovery plans. And you start with a business impact analysis. If this piece of data is not available, or if these systems aren't available, how long can you be down before it negatively impacts revenue? For some business, it could be several days. For others, if you can't open the doors, you can't collect revenue, that's an immediate impact. Now, then you work backwards with it and say, if I don't collect that revenue, what's it going to cost me? And what's that relative to the solution to secure? And you can use that analysis with any business, any solution that you're trying to bring forward that costs money to an organization. You just have to start at a point where you can relate it to the business. And if this happens, this is what's going to happen, and you're not going to collect revenue. And that's how businesses keep the doors open, is revenue coming in the door.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this interesting is Wayne Selk of CompTIA, who delivers a really, really interesting security business risk workshop. and he travels around the world doing this, and he speaks to a lot of groups of people about it. He talks so purposefully about this business impact analysis, and I think that's a key piece of starting the conversation on the right foot. And an interesting challenge too, again, when you've come into a relationship a lot more operationally or tactically focused, it becomes a little bit more difficult as time passes to kind of pull back out to say like, hey, I think we should do a business impact analysis. It's like, oh, it's okay, just make sure the computers keep running. And then you're kind of dismissed off over to the sidelines, and you just never get the chance to redo, to have a go again at that. And so this is what starts an interesting process of MSPs, bifurcating their approach to working with clients. The same thing happened with Breakfix and managed services. They were all so hyper-focused on trying to transition. We were also hyper-focused on, I'm going to convert all my Breakfix clients to managed services, not realizing it's a really, really difficult transition to make. Instead, you kind of just draw a line in the sand. It's like, from this point on, any new client we're going to do under this model. And this, of course, increases operational complexity. And I think operational complexity is kind of the academic enemy of MSPs. And so I wanted to get into this idea of operational inefficiency, because I think MSPs have been beat over the head for years around, simplifying operational complexity, making sure every client is standardized, doing basically the same thing, rinse and repeat across the board.
Right.
And I think where strategy is concerned, this is obviously where that, honeymoon ends, perhaps, because I think the challenge is every business is unique in their own ways. The way the executives are going to relate to you is different. So I wanted to ask you about the standardization or lack thereof in your approach to working with each client, especially now that you have sort of this interesting benefit of being strategically focused almost exclusively and not so much in the weeds, of course.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I've got a very recent example of it. So one of my clients is moving over to a different MSP, and so we sit in a meeting, a kickoff meeting, and the client or the MSP is outlining everything they're going to do. We're going to do this. 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 And when they, and when they got done with the call, they're like, "Hey, thank you very much. Let us know if you need anything." And then they're going to march down. And I got a call from the client that says they don't know anything about my business, but yet they're coming in and telling me what they're going to do, what solutions we're going to put in place, what dates they're going to put them in place. They didn't talk about at all the impact on my business. They were not focused at all on my business. They were focused on what was good for them. And so that becomes very apparent, Luis, is to a business owner that if an MSP comes in with the mindset that these are my standard tools, these are the standard things I do, these are what we're going to do, and you'll like it. It doesn't play well in the long term.
I had this YouTuber / creative on the live stream a few weeks ago, Kris Jensen, and he's a couple million followers on YouTube, and he had similar insights in that. I think one of the challenges, specifically around the impact to the business, is that MSPs tend to come in to a new relationship with this big bang remediation. Be like, we've decided as an MSP that your entire business should look like this, no matter who you are, yeah. Right? And this is simply accounting for standard baseline best practices. That's not even getting into the nuances of how that business operates or anything like that. And I think that there's a disconnect there, because the business owner doesn't understand that there's a minimum baseline of performance that is required to, provide some kind of stable support. But the interesting thing that Kris kind of observed is that it's not your job to be the best option. It's your job to be the least risky option. And from the perspective of the client, his insight was that risk comes masked in many different ways. And one of them is when you are proposing too much change at the same time, clients, they may not even necessarily understand what the impact of all this change at the same time is going to be, but they're going to push back from it because it's this sounds like a lot. I'm not sure that we're ready for any of this. Game over, right? And so I guess maybe expand a bit on this idea of piecemealing a bit of this approach to large projects to lessen the risk, of course, of doing it in smaller chunks, but also the perspective from the client of this seems more manageable to us as a business to take on all these things.
Well, what it comes down to is managing expectations right up front. So if you come in and you phrased it or framed it perfectly, as an MSP is coming in saying, I need to reduce the risk. I need to reduce the risk for me. I need to reduce the risk for you. And so this is a tried and true solution that I've done across the board. But it requires an educational session. You have to spend time with the client, hearing what their concerns are, hearing what their challenges are, and then adapting that. So do you have to do the whole thing? In this particular case, me being the fractional CIO stepped in and said, okay, hey, we're not going to do this. We're not going to do this. We're not going to do this. And the MSP pushed back and said, well, that's what we do for all the clients. I said, but is it critical? Well, no, it's not critical. Then why did you propose it if it's not critical? Let's layer it in, and it comes down to trust. You've got to develop trust, and just because you signed a contract, just because they agreed to do work with you, doesn't mean they trust you. And trust is developed over time. And so, do good things, do the critical things, and then layer them in as you go along to get where you need to be. And if it's critical to securing the organization, then just spend time explaining it, but don't shove it down somebody's throat.
Yeah. I'm curious if you've come across situations where, as a fractional CIO, you're working with an MSP's vCIO in any given situation. That seems like a little bit of an inception moment, perhaps. Competing priorities.
Yeah, no, I have, and it's a good relationship, and the reason being, and my experience is may not be the norm, but usually the vCIO for the MSP is very infrastructure focused. They came up through it, system engineer, network engineer, work there. They've never worked in a business. And when I say never, they've not worked in a different realm outside the technology. And so there's a good, for me, there's a good synergy because that's an area that I understand, but I need somebody who I can really trust. And on the other side, they may not understand the business applications and what the interplay with it. So I look at it as a very collaborative relationship.
Yeah, I think there's just seems to be more and more of this collaborative, co-managed IT situations, and
Yes.
and as MSPs, get in their head that they want to go more and more up market, that just kind of becomes the reality. I was curious to ask you a bit of maybe the crystal ball of the CIO and or vCIO role. Obviously, security right now is a big deal. Compliance is a big deal. We didn't really touch on compliance. It was curious to ask you as well how much of a role
No.
you play in the compliance efforts that any of your clients are taking on to align their framework and so on. But maybe a bit of your future take on the role of the CIO.
Uh, it, as I look at it, the role of the CIO is evolving, particularly in the middle market. Now, in the enterprise, it's been pretty much the same, but what's happening is CIOs are taking on more of a security posture, more than ever before, because a lot of organizations can't afford a CISO. So somebody's got to step in that role and not be a CISO, but look at compliance and security as a key component. The CIO is going to continue to do, in my crystal ball, do what they do, but they're going to have to rely more on outside parties to really fill the gap on the security side of it. They're going to have to be more reliant on an MSSP or an MSP to be an advisor or a guidance to them. But and as I see it, CIOs are going to really evolve to really move the business in a different way, because the MSPs coming in and sliding into the infrastructure, what I call the infrastructure or the tactical side. So it really frees up the CIO to really focus on the strategic side of how to run the business.
And I think we're seeing a bit of the same thing play out with MSPs. There's always been this conversation of whether your MSP needs to become an MSSP and start doing a lot of the security stuff in-house, or
Yep.
perhaps you call yourself one, but you're outsourcing a lot of the security things. And again, a lot of it seems to be a function of the size of the MSP and how much they can actually take on internally. But people seem to be coming to the same, all roads lead to it. It's really hard to build a SOC. It's really hard to run a
Yes.
SIM and some other SOAR platform internally. And they're partnering much more with the security vendors. And another interesting thing I've started to see, and this obviously doesn't, it's not the same as with hardware, where like an MSP might have leveraged the brand of a hardware vendor as a selling point to go to their clients. I think in the past, MSPs were very intent on white labeling everything. Even if it was outsourced,
Yeah.
they'd call it, our MSP SOC service, this, and that, and the other. And of course, a lot of the legal situations and liability and the challenges around compliance are starting to play a role in the MSPs kind of disconnecting a bit from their brand and be like, yeah, we work with so-and-so partner. They are the provider that delivers this. It may not change, who the finger gets pointed at when there's an incident, but I think it's an interesting trend for sure that continues evolving. And I'm sure, again, you just described the same thing as happening at the enterprise level.
Yeah, as you know, just what happened with Cloudflare, the issue with Cloudflare. I was on a call this morning where CIOs are talking about this and saying, okay, what went wrong? How do we avoid? How do you keep an enterprise from going down because of one vendor? And the conversation was around in the room was we can't rely on one. We're going to have to rely on many. To and that wouldn't have necessarily avoided the Cloudflare issue, but it's just the idea that the reliance on one vendor is becoming problematic. And
Mm.
MSPs, when they white label this stuff, they create this box around things. They're going to they have exposure by doing that. And so I'm with you. I see MSPs starting to kind of move away from that, just because the risk profile that they're taking on is pretty significant.
Yeah, yeah, very interesting indeed. Well, Kris, I have maybe one last question for you to try and. I know there's a lot of folks in the MSP ecosystem, and I think this vCIO role has the best of intentions. I see a lot of folks growing into a really talented individual that is, crossing a bit of that chasm from tactically operated, coin operated to, hey, we really
Yeah.
need to start working strategically with our clients and helping them move their technology forward and all these things. What would you say, from your perspective, are key competencies required for CIOs or vCIOs to look to build as they get deeper and deeper into this kind of role?
Um, a knowledge of business transactions, understanding what moves the needle for an organization. You don't have to know that a construction company does X, Y, and Z, but you need to understand these are the things that they make money doing. And so I think as technical folks want to move, come from a technical perspective, want to move their way into the business, spend some time understanding business concepts, business philosophies. I always say figure out what an income statement and a balance sheet is and a cash flow statement. It
Mhm.
goes a long way. And you don't have to be an MBA. You don't have to do that side. But if you can spend a little time understanding process and where process moves things, they're in a great position to move into those more strategic roles, because then you're thinking differently. You're thinking differently about what the situation is. You're not thinking, how do I keep the lights on? You're thinking, I want to keep the lights on, but how do I make this more efficient? How do I make this more cost affordable? It's just a different mindset, but it's not unique. In other words, what I do is not unique to me. I think anybody can figure it out. It just requires a different. You have to frame things differently.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the framing is the thing that's so key. And again, in the machine that is sometimes standardization inside of an MSP that is potentially increasingly difficult. It takes, I guess, a lot of stamina to try and pull away from the status quo and try and do things a little bit differently. And maybe the effort versus reward, or the timeline of the effort versus reward, because I would imagine that in your case, a lot of the early work may not see dividends for months or even years at a time. And some of these initiatives can be large, even for a small business. Ripping out a CRM, ripping out an ERP, and transitioning to something else that's going to better suit their growth may be an 18-month project.
Yeah.
And people sometimes have very little patience for these things, even the ones that are experienced in big projects. But
No, you're
yeah.
right. And that's why I say, I like to look at things. Am I going into it with a transactional mindset? Am I trying to do X, Y, and Z? Or am I really trying to build kind of a long-term roadmap, a long-term plan that does take time to develop? You're not going to see it overnight. It's going to take 12 to 18 months to see what you started with and what you end with. But it's possible. Sometimes you have to compress all that, but you still have to go through the same steps.
Yeah. Well, Kris, this has been incredible. Thank you so much for all these very, very useful and deep insights. I think confirmation bias here is that a lot of the things that I've been thinking is very much reflected in some of your thinking as well. And there's a lot of work to be done in the vCIO space in the MSP context, I think, to get more closer to that strategic conversation. So hopefully folks have some ideas, some comments, are listening, and maybe start to incorporate a bit of that thinking into their process. In the meantime, thank you again for your time and your generous knowledge sharing, and I hope we can do this again.
No, Louise, I do appreciate it, and thank you. From the bottom of my heart, I enjoy doing this. One parting word I have, to MSPs who are listening. Not everybody wants to do this, but I want to partner with the MSP. I really want to, if they're trying to build this practice, let me help you, give you some guidance to help you build a practice. It will not be something you do overnight, and I don't look at it as a competing item. I really look at it as complementary to one another.
Yeah, I think those opportunities abound, and as territorial as MSPs tend to be, I think there is very much a sense of community around this, and the sooner they realize they're maybe not at the level of developing the ability to deploy this very, very strategically focused outcome, I think it suits them really, really well to have somebody on their team to help drive a bit of that agenda as well. So.
Yep,
very well said.
for sure.
For those that are watching on LinkedIn, of course, hit Kris up from the LinkedIn live. Or if you're watching on YouTube, I'll make sure to put Kris's LinkedIn profile on YouTube as well. So feel free to reach out and connect. Again, thank you so much, Kris. To everybody joining, we'll see you next Friday, August 2nd for MSP Confidential.